Hello everyone and welcome to this series of Did You Know JavaScript. Today we are going to talk about arrow functions and we are going to look deep into what is the difference between arrow functions and normal functions, which usually people ignore. Arrow functions. Arrow functions are a shorthand way of writing the normal functions. They are generally used for anonymous functions. So in most of the case in ES6, you will find 99.999% usage of arrow functions as anonymous functions. The reason why they are popular is because they are less verbose. But this is also one of the reasons that is causing the problems for people to read it because of lack of awareness of different variations that they have. Arrow functions have as many as 5 to 6 variations. But what I would recommend is stick to one. You don't need to follow all the rules of arrow functions. Let's say if it's a single parameter function, if it's a multiple parameter functions, you can totally ignore that and you can stick to one format and you can carry on your normal work. That will make it easier for your developers to read the code of arrow functions. There are differences in arrow functions and normal function calls. So we are going to look at those differences as well. But let us get started with the variations of arrow functions. So I have a file here and I have created our simple button, click me button, and inside index.js what am I going to do is where my button equal to document dot get element by id, and I'll get the id of the button, click me button, and I'll add a event listener to this button. Now this was the old way of writing the functions, ES5 way. I'll say click and then I'll write a function keyword with open and closing parentheses and curly braces. So this was the old way of writing the functions, and if I wanted to do some processing over here, I'll write alert button clicked, and I can also access the event parameter, that what event has been fired from the click button. So we have a function keyword, we have opening and closing parenthesis, and we have a event parameter, and we have opening and closing curly braces along with one statement to be executed in the function. Now let's execute it. Yep, it's running right now. We go to the begin folder and we have a click me button over here. So if I click, it will give me an alert. So that's how the normal functions used to work. Let's go ahead and write it in ES6 way. Now, since arrow functions are the less verbose versions of the function, that means that it reduces quite a lot of things. So, firstly, the arrow functions gets rid of the function keyword, and it gives us this particular symbol that is equal to followed by greater than sign, and this is your arrow function. This is how you write arrow function. So I've got rid of the function keyword and you've just added this symbol equal to and greater than, and that is your function, and it works the same way. So let's just comment this out. I click, it works the same way. Now since the function has only one parameter, what happens is we can even get rid of the round parentheses, and this will work as it is. So let's go ahead and try it. Yes, it does work. So in case of a single parameter, you can avoid using the parentheses, so that makes it even less verbose. Also, since it's a single statement function, this function has only one statement to be executed. you can also get rid of the curly braces. See how less verbose the function has become? So if I go ahead and execute this, it will give me the same result. So that means we learned that the variants of arrow function are event, let's say, just I'll write it for a reference here, X, alert X. This is one of the variant. In the single parameter case, you can avoid the round parenthesis, and in the case of single statement, you can even avoid the curly braces. All these are valid arrow functions. Now, what if the function is returning something and the return is the only statement of the function? What we could have done is we could have skipped the return statement once and for all. So you would have thought, let's say x is the parameter that is getting passed and this is the arrow function representation, and the function is returning x or x into 2, right? It's a valid function, valid arrow function. We can avoid using return keyword altogether, and we can also skip the curly braces. So arrow function with return keyword and arrow function without. This can be written something as x returns x into 2. So we have gotten rid of the return keyword, we have gotten rid of the parenthesis, we have gotten rid of round parenthesis. This is one more variant of arrow function. Now this works only if you have a single statement for execution inside your function. It cannot work if you have multiple statements. So beware of it. If you are having no curly braces, that means it is assumed that it is the only statement to be executed inside the function. Now you can avoid the round braces if you have a single parameter, but if you have multiple parameters, you will have to use the round braces. So something like this, x, y, return x plus y. So if you have multiple parameters inside your function, you will have to use the round braces. And if you have multiple statements, like something like this, x comma y, where you are doing something like x equal to x into 2, y equal to y into 2, and if you have to return in such cases, you would have to use a return keyword x plus y. Oh, sorry, y equal to y into 2 and return x plus y. So in this case, you cannot skip return keyword, you cannot skip curly braces, you cannot skip the round parenthesis. So beware of this rules in arrow functions. This means that being less verbose comes at a cost of remembering a few things or a few rules, saying that do you have a single statement, is it a return statement, or is it a non-return statement, do you have multiple statements, do you have a single parameter, do you have multiple parameters. All these things you have to keep in mind. You can avoid that by following one fixed syntax. There's no such rule as good or bad inside ES6, and there will be some ES6 people who say that, oh, you have single parameter, but why do you use round braces? Why don't you avoid the braces altogether? You have a single statement, why are you using curly braces? But you can totally ignore them. You can go ahead and follow a fixed pattern even if you have a single parameter, and even if you have a single return statement. So you can totally follow this rule and you can avoid anything else. The reason for this is you can increase the consistency, you can increase the readability of the function, and this will help people spend less of a time of what this is and figure out by reading the code and get into the code directly. Now let us go ahead and see the difference between arrow function and the normal function. So let's say if we have a dog object and dog sounds like woof, and let's say if we have a function which is speak, and we are using a normal function in this case, and we can access the sound property saying this dot sound. So when I go ahead and say dog dot speak, it will give us woof because it can access the sound property. So here we are, it says woof. But if we had an arrow function, let's say we say speak arrow, and when I say dog.speak arrow, it will give me an error because arrow functions don't have access to this keyword. So arrow functions don't have access to this keyword, and hence it returns me undefined. So if I go ahead and show you the difference, arrow functions don't have their own context, they don't have access to this keyword. So we saw that arrow functions don't have access to this keyword and it returns us undefined. Now you must have also seen something like this. Let's say we had set timeout inside this function, and we are doing console.log after 100 milliseconds. Now if we go ahead and look, what will be the output of this function? If you are guessing the output would be woof, then you are wrong. The output would be undefined, because by the time this function gets executed, the context has already changed and sound is no longer available. So to overcome this, you used to do some circus like this. You used to come over here and then say dot bind this. Now when you have done this, the sound property would be still available after 100 milliseconds to this internal function, and you can execute this function and you can get the output woof. So you have got the output woof. But if you're using an arrow function, you can totally avoid this circus, and you can say that set timeout arrow function execute console.log this.sound. So if you go ahead and access this, you'll get the output woof. Now I had said that arrow functions don't have access to this property, but arrow function by default then goes ahead and looks into the parent context. This is an example of closure where arrow functions work great. If you have an asynchronous function where the context needs to be remembered, then arrow functions are great. Second difference, arguments. Now the next main difference between arrow and normal function is availability of arguments parameter. In normal functions, you can access arguments when you don't know what are the number of arguments getting passed inside the function. So let's say if I have a function add all numbers, and I can pass any number of parameters to this and then say console.log arguments. So arguments would be able to access all the parameters that are getting passed inside add all numbers and give it to us in an array format. So let's say if I do add all numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it will give me an array with 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 inside it. So this is the arguments array. So it's an array. Now if I do the same thing with arrow functions, I don't have access to arguments parameter at all. So let's say if I do something like this, this is a valid arrow function, and if I pass arguments to it, I don't have access to it. So it says arguments is not defined. In order to overcome that, you can use REST parameters. So something like this. So if I try to do this, it will give me an output of an array of all numbers, that is all the parameters that are passed to the function. So normal functions have access to arguments variable, arrow functions don't have access to arguments variable. You can use REST parameters in that case. The third difference between arrow and normal functions is you can use normal functions to create a class, but you cannot use arrow functions to create a class because they are not a constructor. So let's take an example. Vehicle, let's say function vehicle. You can add wheels and type. Then you can say this dot wheels equal to wheels and this dot type equal to type. Now you can go ahead and use vehicle as a class. And type is car. But if the same thing was defined in an arrow function, so you'll get an error, vehicle arrow is not a constructor. So these are the main differences between a arrow function and a normal function. In an interview, if you say these three differences, you're surely to get an edge over others. So I hope you enjoyed the difference between arrow functions and normal functions, as well as what are the arrow functions. Please like and subscribe and share this video, and thank you for watching Everyday JavaScript.